Awesome. I see you have somebody that's into science now, so now we could talk about
That's me.
That's awesome.
If you want to talk about flat Earth, I'm an aerospace engineer, so I can tell you.
Oh, really? Well, that's
Yes.
what I want to talk about. That's
I need popcorn. So what did you want to
so
talk
here's so last week I called it about. I said that there was two proofs for intelligent design, and we talked about, the DNA and everything. I don't want to get to that, but
Okay.
so the second proof, which is the absolute trump card, the absolute number one proof that
Oh,
we are
man.
in an intelligently designed universe. I know you atheists have been seeking for this answer for a long time.
No, we don't.
And here it is.
No, the answer is that you are constantly looking for truth in things, because if you settle on one thing and you're wrong, you're less likely to dig in your heels, but you just want to, like we said just a minute ago.
Be okay with being wrong.
Yeah, know as many true things and as few false
Oh,
things.
no, yeah, I love being wrong, believe me.
Yeah, so you go right ahead. What is your ultimate thing? Go ahead.
Okay, so that we are not on a ball that's spinning 1,000 miles an hour, that's going around the sun 66,600 miles an hour, going around the galaxy 550,000 miles an hour, and the galaxy going through the universe at 1.5 million miles an hour. Absolutely just absurd. The Earth is operationally and functionally flat.
I highly suggest there's a amazing Monty Python song that does that. But this is so in your ballpark, EJ. I don't even want.
Well, I'm waiting to hear what the proof is.
Okay, so the proof that we're not on a spinning ball, number one, is that water cannot conform to the exterior of a shape. You cannot do an experiment to make water go around any shape and stay there, like the way that the water of the Earth is, excuse me, going around the Earth, right? And then they say, oh, gravity. Okay, we should get into gravity. It's absolutely absurd. Also, how many things that gravity does magically, it does like a million different things. And it's all this one force that does all of these things. But if you disprove that one thing, that means that everything that you believe about the entire universe is wrong.
Well, first of all,
new cosmology.
First of all, gravity is measurable. We have a lot of evidence that gravity exists. There are a lot of different ways that we can prove that gravity exists. In regards to the whole water conforming to a ball thing, I think the big problem that you're having is that it's really difficult to think about things in 3D, because the force of gravity is due to the massiveness of an object. So, I have gravity, Eric has gravity, you have gravity, but because we're such small objects, our gravity is basically negligible. It doesn't really do anything.
Well,
but when you get a lot of mass in one place...
Cavendish.
Sorry?
So you should tell that to Cavendish, because Cavendish actually, when he did that test, which is the only test in existence to prove, quote unquote, prove that one object can attract another object by virtue of its mass alone,
Victor?
He was so sure that the test was so sensitive. The test was so sensitive that when he went to go take the measurements, he took the measurements outside of the barn, 100 feet away, with a telescope, because he didn't want his own gravity to interfere with the test. So if you're saying that your gravity is so small that it'll never affect anything, you should tell it to Cavendish.
I mean, I can't speak to, I can't say I'm familiar with Cavendish, but whenever
Well,
that...
you should.
I actually can.
Victor.
Victor.
I don't know who Cavendish is.
Yeah,
That's
Victor.
The only,
Victor, hello. You do know that the Cavendish experiment has been replicated by students every year at major universities for many years. It has been replicated so many times that it's almost a rite of passage at some colleges to perform the Cavendish experiment. You do know that, right?
Okay, so let's say that this is true. Let's say that the Cavendish experiment is true. So gravity is.
Whoa, hold on. So, if are we sure about that? Are you good there?
I'm just gonna play devil's advocate.
You're playing devil's advocate? Okay, so what I suggest before you play devil's advocate is that you go to a university and talk to somebody. Because either one...
all the experiments on YouTube, I've seen them do it.
Go to a university,
that it's some other force.
Talk to somebody, and then you get to decide whether or not you're wrong or the entire world is against you in some major conspiracy.
Well, before we make the appeal to popular belief, something that might help with visualizing how gravity works in a more 2D version is looking up experiments where they take an elastic sheet and you put like a really heavy, like a ball in the elastic sheet, and then you can roll marbles, and the marble will actually orbit the ball as it kind of like spirals in, and that's a really good.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does. There are videos of this.
No, it doesn't. No, it goes directly to the center.
No. If you give it,
go around a little bit. It'll go
if
around
you give it a velocity.
and then it always goes towards the center.
Well, that's what I was saying. Yeah, it spirals in towards the center. That's how gravity works. It's an attractive force. And if you don't give it a velocity, it does go straight in. And that's exactly how gravity works, except in 3D. So when you have a mass, it essentially... Space-time is a complicated thing, and we could get into quantum mechanics, and we could get into relativity and general relativity and special relativity. But frankly, I don't want to have that conversation because that's one that requires several degrees to talk about.
When is Mercury going to get sucked into the sun? If it's been orbiting around the sun for like billions of years, when is it ever going to go towards into the sun? If the sun is so massive, the sun is a million times the volume of Earth. They could put 1 million Earths inside the sun. So that should just mean that Mercury should just make a straight beeline right into the sun. How come it's just going around in a circle? To me, that makes absolutely no sense.
I can answer that. So I took a class last semester called Spacecraft Dynamics. I'm currently in a class this semester called Applied Orbital Mechanics. And the way that it works is if you have something that is very gravitationally, powerful because it's very massive, you have an orbit. The way that an orbit works is the object is moving. And so you can almost think of it as it's falling towards the object, but it's falling sideways. So it's just constantly kind of falling in towards the object, but it's going around because it has that velocity that's making it go that way. And so it can be a little bit difficult to visualize, but those forces and the energy required to maintain that orbit can be calculated really precisely. Like Mercury is going the velocity that it needs to go to not get sucked into the sun. But fun fact, the moon actually is getting sucked in towards the Earth. Every year it moves a couple centimeters closer. Because it's so far away that it'll be a really, really, really long time before the moon gets close enough to actually be, drawn into the Earth's gravity. But it is moving closer, and that's something that we can measure.
Wouldn't that? Yeah, but okay. So now the Earth is going around the sun, right? So if the Earth is going around the sun, so you do understand that somehow, some way, in the wintertime, it's actually closer towards the sun. It's 3 million miles closer.
Yeah, it's in an elliptical orbit,
actually.
Yeah.
So when the Earth is going closer towards the sun, how come the moon doesn't get pulled more towards the sun when it's 3 million miles closer towards it?
Well, it does. I mean, gravitational forces act on everything. It does have an effect, and in fact, those are things that you can account for in measuring orbits, and even in the orbit of a spacecraft, like the class that I'm taking right now, part of what we have to do is we have to account for the perturbations in the orbit caused by the sun's gravity versus the moon's gravity versus the Earth's gravity versus the shape of the Earth. Just even the fact that the Earth is not a perfect sphere affects the way that an orbit will move, and the orbit parameters will actually change over time because of the different gravitational effects of the different bodies in the solar system. And I mean, a lot of this is things that are measurable and things that we do account for in terms of measuring orbits and creating orbits and calculating the exact amount of fuel you would need to get to a certain orbit and the exact amount of velocity that you would need to leave one orbit and get to a different orbit. And these are all things that are, if you take a class on orbital mechanics, you'll actually learn about it. And it's really fascinating. I mean, I could talk about it all day. I'm sure I'm boring you with talk about orbit mechanics.
Yeah,
but,
I just think that, like, if you have something that has such an enormous amount of gravitational force, and then you have something as small as the moon, and then you have the Earth that goes 3 million miles closer towards the sun, it's going to throw off the orbital mechanics of the moon and the Earth relationship, and it's just going to, there's no way, there is absolutely no way. The Earth has been doing this, Earth has been doing this orbit around the Earth for 4.5 billion years.
What's interesting about that is that the gravitational force is actually not a particularly strong one. The gravitational... I
ain't even mad, bro. Go ahead.
Cavendish proved that it exists with just an object that's only 260 times heavier than another object.
Gravity does exist. It's just not a particularly strong force in terms of other forces that exist in the universe. Magnetism is also a fairly weak force. It has an inverse square relationship to the distance from the object. And so because you have that inverse square relationship, as you get further and further from an object, the gravity force gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And because we're so far away from the sun, yes, its gravity is strong. It's very, very massive. But 3 million miles over, however many dozens, hundreds of millions of miles we are from the sun, 3 million miles is actually not a huge difference in terms of that inverse square relationship and the strength of the gravitational force.
It's actually like 3 or 4% closer. To me, that's a pretty large margin.
It's not a large margin when you have an inverse square relationship with the force.
You have all these like super complex orbital mechanics, inverse square law. Like, isn't it more in accordance with Occam's razor to just be like, the sun is just orbiting over my head because that's how I observe it, right? Then when you go outside, right, and I look straight up in the air.
But Occam's razor applies to situations where the other options aren't viable, whereas these things are measurable. I'm in a class right now. My professor for this class, his whole life is he does this kind of orbital mechanics. He works for a bunch of different organizations that he's done these calculations for, and they launch satellites, and you have to do all of these complex calculations in order to make sure the orbit is where you need it to be to accomplish what you need it to accomplish. Like satellites that provide your internet, they have to be in a particular orbit, otherwise it's not actually going to function, and you need to know where that satellite is.
Don't exist.
Satellites don't exist.
Satellites is absolutely ridiculous.
Then how are you calling us right now?
No, there's no such thing as satellites. So if a grain of sand hits a satellite, the satellite is completely destroyed. It's going at 17,500 miles an hour, and we have, 30,000 satellites in the sky? How is it that not one of these satellites ever gets hit by something?
They absolutely do get hit by things.
25 years or something,
Victor,
and the ISS never gets hit by anything, and it never loses its orbit.
Victor, when you make a statement and the other person wants to respond, you need to let them respond, because you're saying a thing and then you're blasting off with more things, and we can't respond to any of those things.
Also, when you say a statement, you kind of need to back it up with evidence. Like, do you have a study that shows, well, satellites don't actually exist? Because I have a lot of evidence in my classes that satellites do exist.
It's just simple logic. If you have 30,000 satellites in there, if one of these satellites gets hit by something the size of a grain of sand going at 17,500 miles an hour, that satellite will be absolutely destroyed.
Actually, satellites do get hit by things all the time.
It's going to hit it at such a force that it's going to pull off your orbital mechanic of it, and there's no way that you're going to be able to correct the orbit of the satellite, because you're in a vacuum, right? And you can't steer it. It's not like you have rudders on it.
These are all things. These are things you can account for.
So once you get hit, that's it. It's over.
Well, okay. First of all, responding to your first point, space debris is a real concern. There's a whole lot of there are governmental organizations whose entire job is to track space debris. There are companies like SpaceX or whatever, they have to track space debris because you need to know where it is. And we know the orbits that a lot of space debris exists in, but you need to know where space debris is, because it will actually damage satellites. Like you said, satellites do get damaged. I mean, there are satellites that get damaged, and we have to send up other satellites to repair them.
That's ridiculous. How can you believe this? It's science.
I believe it because I'm studying it, and I know the science behind it.
Religion.
And because Victor,
Victor,
EJ is not appealing to personal incredulity, but wants to actually learn the thing. EJ is not saying, hold on, EJ is not saying, I can't understand it, therefore it's not true. And up until this point, that does sound pretty much like what you're saying. So
no, I'm saying that it's impossible. There's no way that these things, as you're saying the things that you believe. See, the things with like. Well,
the difference here is that it's not something that I believe. It's something that I know to be true.
When you're actually explaining these things to someone like me, and then you start realizing how ridiculous this is, you start laughing, because you just said, "Oh well, what the
I'm actually laughing at what you're saying."
We have to send up other satellites to fix them. This is science fiction. This is not true. Okay? How can you have a satellite up there and then it gets hit by something, and then you send up another satellite going 17,500 miles an hour to go and fix it? Come on, what are you joking?
Because we can calculate the necessary thrust that you need to get it into the atmosphere, and you can calculate the amount of fuel that you need to produce the thrust to get into the orbit that you need. Like, I know I could sit here and calculate, okay, this is the velocity that I need to be in this exact orbit, and this is the velocity that I'll need to have in order to catch up to this particular satellite. I mean, there's entire fields dedicated to how do I go from the orbit that I'm in to the orbit that I want to be in? How do I catch up to a spacecraft that I want to be, next to? It's entire complex fields of orbital mechanics that you could take, 7, 8, 9, 10 classes on it and still, have more to learn. And it's really fascinating because there's so much to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, so The ISS has been up there for, 20 years, never gets hit by anything.
It absolutely does get hit by things. Space debris is a big issue.
If the ISS gets hit by something, then the orbit of the object, there's no way you can correct the orbit of the ISS.
That's patently untrue.
Yeah. So
how is it untrue?
So
because. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. Find evidence to back up your assertions. Email it to us. Email it to us, Victor.
To refute what you believe. That would
you're so
dismissed without
quick.
evidence.
Well,
yeah, there's evidence. You're just not willing to look it up.
Yeah, I mean,
we're not responsible for forcing you.
We understand how forces function. Like, I can calculate the torque that would be applied to the ISS by space debris impacting it if I know the mass and the velocity of the debris that hits it.
Right. But just because you could do a mathematical equation to prove something, that doesn't mean that it's real. I could do a mathematical equation right now.
I can do that mathematical equation, and then
the Drake equation 2.0 and say that the dragons created the universe 7 trillion years ago, and I'd be like, oh, since I created the mathematical equation, you can't say that I'm wrong. Well, I just made this equation. It makes all sense in the world, and I just proved that dragons created the universe.
You brought up Occam's razor earlier, so let me bring up an Occam's razor to you. What's more likely, that we can calculate these things and then we can measure them to be true, and we can check our calculations and that they're accurate, and we can check that, well, we can observe this satellite through a telescope, like we can check that these things are true, or there's a huge governmental conspiracy that says that these things are true, even though there's not, No,
you just said that you could see a satellite and a telescope?
Absolutely. You need the right telescope, and you need to know exactly its position in the sky that you were looking for. You can look. You can see the ISS.
Heathen's website or something like that.
Wonderful idea. For those of you who are watching, hop onto the Facebook, Talk Heathen Facebook, and please, just demonstrate to him.
Victor,
you can actually see the ISS.
Listen. I'll just prove satellites right now. If it's so easy to prove that satellites exist, you just said right now that you could use a telescope, a special telescope, and you can see satellites. So that must mean that there must be thousands or millions of images of satellites online, right? So let's go to Google right now. Let's.
The University of Google.
Go on Google right now.
Here, I have a fun
satellite.
Victor, listen, Victor. I have a fun experiment for you. Okay. There's a website where you can look up exactly when the ISS will be passing overhead and be visible. I can't remember the website off the top of my head, but you can find it pretty easily. And it's literally just, it will tell you which satellites would be passing overhead. You can look up, in this time period, when will the ISS be visible? And it's generally visible close to sunrise or close to sunset, because you can see it kind of like in the, it's hard to describe exactly where you can look up exactly where it will be located, the latitude and longitude. And you can see that with the naked eye. You don't even need a telescope to see the ISS.
Exactly.
So go look up, Victor, I have homework for you. I have homework for you.
Let's pause right there.
I have homework for you.
Right there. You just
look up.
Listen.
Look up when the ISS will be passing overhead.
Yeah. Victor, you're on hold.
Yeah. Look up when the ISS will be passing overhead, and then get outside at that time and look for it. Because if you look hard enough, you will see it. The ISS is visible to the naked eye.
Yeah. And Victor, this is not your show. So we tell you, and you can be good with it or not. That's fine. But when we have something to say and you won't let them talk, then you get put on hold. So I'm going to take you off of hold. You still there?
Yes, you just made. Hello?
Were you talking so much that you didn't know I put you on hold and talked to you?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, okay. Call back when you can do that. All right.
Ooh.
So.
All right, that was fun. I got my heart rate up. Yeah.
So you're amazing. You are so amazing.
Listen, I'm an aerospace engineer, baby. You can tell me that Earth is flat.
I need a show for you, and I need to open for you, and I'm gonna be like, holy crap, I knew EJ back in the day.
Orbital mechanics.
Do it. Oh my gosh, that is.
Listen, orbital mechanics and spacecraft dynamics were my favorite classes. So I'll talk to you all day about this. I took an exam last week on this stuff, so come on.
Come on. I am so glad that people as smart as you exist, because that just oh man, we would be screwed as a species if everybody was where I'm at. So I'm so glad that other people can do the hard work there, because man, that made my day. That made my day.